Hello, I'm Mark Tucker,
And I'm Alan Furstenberg. Welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Hey, Alan, how's it been?
Busy, back to coding, more or less. So yeah, I had last week was not a good coding week. This week was a little better coding week.
Well, hopefully, yeah. There's always challenges. There's lots of different hats we wear, so to speak.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's design, sometimes it's administration of systems, sometimes it's architecture. Design, all kinds of different things.
but we're developers. We're
definitely developers at heart. So when we get into kind of the flow, or get into the flow and not be interrupted by too many things, then that's always a good day and a good week.
interrupted by things is actually a funny way to put this, because that's kind of what I was thinking about talking about this week was what happens when the conversation gets interrupted. We always designers love talking about the happy path.
Yes.
Well, what happens when we fall off the happy path?
Oh, are you hinting at fallback intents?
I'm hinting at fallback intents and error recovery and fun stuff like that.
That's a good topic. Let's dive into that.
And speaking of error recovery, for those that may be watching, we seem to have some video problems. So if Mark looks a little more stiff than usual, it's not him. So yeah, fallback intents are always interesting. When Google first launched using Dialogflow, there's this very concrete fallback intent that kind of covered a host of cases. And I think a lot of people didn't really get the best way to use it, or weren't really thinking about what it could be used for. And then Google's kind of changed how fallback intents work a little bit over the years. So those have introduced some challenges.
So what are fallback intents?
So briefly speaking, fallback intents are, it's what happens when you're not on the path, when the user says something that you don't expect at all, that you have nothing, you're not prepared for at all. It's kind of like the intent of last resort, is how I think of it. When nothing matched, you hit the fallback intent.
So the action or the skill or capsule is only as good as understanding what the user is saying, that based on what they've been trained, right, to understand. So if you're I always test this when I'm going through and I get to a certain point and I say like pizza jumps over the rainbow or some weird thing, right? I don't know, just then it's like not something that nobody is going to say, but it's like I just think of some like nonsense phrases and I test to see what happens in that point.
Right. It's like when you're using a graphical program and you just start clicking outside the box just to see what it does. Fun. Or you try to drag things where they're not supposed to belong, or do things that you're not allowed to do. Except in the voice case, you don't always know that it's what you're not allowed to do. That's one of the tricky bits when it comes to voice.
Yeah. So that's fallback intent, and I think we'll talk about that definitely. Something else that's interesting, I've been using Jovo quite a bit, and sometimes I'm in a certain context where I want to constrain what intents I'm allowing. Now, that's not really strictly a fallback intent. It's just that some intent that I want to say, or typically say, like if I'm asking something, and the answer is not yes or no, but that's one of my intents that's listed globally as all the different intents that I have. I might want to not handle yes, no, and have that treated similarly to them saying something that's just gibberish or not intended. And that's in the Jovo world, that is termed as unhandled. So it's a little bit different. It's like I know what to do on this, but you're purposely not handling it specifically, and so I want to handle it more generally when it doesn't fit one of the intents I've specifically said to handle.
That's interesting. So why don't you talk a little bit more about how Jovo handles it? And then I also want to talk about how Action Builder handles it and kind of generally
Okay.
how I think about intents. So why don't you talk a little bit about how Jovo addresses the issue?
Okay. Yeah. So, you can specify a fallback intent, and since Jovo's cross-platform, you can map that to the Amazon fallback intent or to the fallback intent that's being used for Action Builder behind the scenes. But in that fallback intent, then you can do things like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said, or can you please say that again, or if you're, and Jovo also has this concept of state. So I'm like, maybe I'm listing a menu and there's certain items, like 2 or 3 items that you can specifically do on this menu. Then you might also handle the fallback in that context and say, if they say something that's not handled, you can be more specific in your guidance. Instead of like, sorry, I can't hear what you're saying. What do you want to do? You're like, oh, I already know I'm in the context of menu. And it's like, oh, make sure that you select an item from the menu, or you can do A, B, and C. Which would you like? So there's a way to handle fallback kind of at the global level and then within a specific state. Similarly with unhandled, there could be something, typically things are handled at the global level, but there might be some cases where you're at a specific state and you've got intents that work there, but you don't want to handle them at the outer level. And so you might have an unhandled there, and that might be more specific, like, you can do this instead of like, I don't understand what you're saying, say it again. It's like, oh, these are the things that you can do right here. And so then you can, inside of each state, you can also have a fallback and an unhandled. Sometimes I remap it to the same thing. So like if I'm saying something, maybe I have a summary or something that's more detailed, and then I ask a prompt. And then when I handle the unhandled or the fallback, I just go back to the prompt part and I re-say the prompt. But then you might also want to keep a counter of how many times that's happened, and like gracefully bow out after 2 or 3 times, or say get more specific in what your guidance is to help them through that part of the flow.
Now we've talked about counters in the past, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And again, we talked about how Jovo had counters and how multivocal had counters and how they were similar but different in some ways. Action Builder does something similar. So one of the features of Action Builder is that everything takes place in a scene, and that scene represents to some extent your state.
Yep.
So in a scene, you can list the intents that are active in that scene. There are also global intents, which are active globally. And then in a scene and globally, there are 2 special types of intents. One are the no match intents, and the other are the no input intents. And these are special cases where, kind of as it implies, no match is similar to a fallback, where the user said something and you don't know how to deal with it. And no input is kind of a special case of no match where it didn't hear anything. So if the user is just either sitting there or the user has wandered away, you might want to deal with that differently than how you handle if they did say something, but you didn't get it.
Well, that's interesting. So that's similar to like how Alexa has a reprompt. So if you don't say something for 7 seconds, it will do a reprompt. And then if they don't say something for 7 more seconds, then the session ends.
Right. In this case, it's only valid on speakers. Everything else just kind of turns off the microphone and waits for you to do something again. So it's of limited use, but it's an interesting element that's there. The other interesting thing is that Action Builder also keeps count itself. So it actually has, of the intents, it actually has an intent called no match 1, no match 2, no match final. And you can set each of them to behave slightly differently. So the first time you could just say, that's not what I'm looking, I didn't understand you. And then maybe the second time you'll say, I'm not sure I heard you. You can do this, this, or this. And then the third time say, we're having some problems today. Why don't you come back later? And automatically on the third time, it will always close.
Yeah,
now,
so that's good, because otherwise you get stuck in this loop of, you say something and they're like, you can, what would you like to do? You can do this and this. What would you like to do? And they're like, oh, and I was like, no, you can do. So another way that I handle that type of scenario is that I handle cancel intent. So you can say cancel or even like go back for previous or things like that. And I handle those whenever I'm in a state, then I handle that as a way to break out of the state.
Oh, that makes sense.
And then I also handle like a restart or start over.
Yeah.
And what's interesting that you can do on Jovo as well is that you can specify an intent at the global level, and then in a configuration file you can say, I forget exactly what the terminology is, but it's like something about listing unhandled handlers. And so what that means is that if you're in a state and you hit one of these handlers and it's not defined, instead of going to the unhandled that's in your current state, it will go back out to the global level and call the intent specifically there. So, and then in that case, I can do a start over. And so there's always a way to break out of that cycle.
This sounds like it's a good way to force change the state no matter what state you're in.
Yeah.
I've done some of that with multivocal and with Action Builder for help. So for example, you want to help is the sort of thing that you want on a global level. You don't want to have to specifically code in each state the help command. You want that globally available, but you also want to be able to return back to the scene that you were in, and you want your help to be context sensitive. So, if I'm in a scene where I'm listing something, that's different than when I'm in a scene that is asking for something. And in each case, I want to give the correct help for that scene.
Yeah, so it's good. Yeah, because I could, at the global level, I could have a help intent. And then only in those states that I want to have something that's more context sensitive, then I redefine help in that context. So when you say help, if it's got help in that state, it says that it's very context sensitive. If you don't, then it says the more general help, but it doesn't push you out to the global level. It just says the general help, but you're still in the context of the state, and then you can continue on with doing what you're doing inside of that state.
So one of the things that I always like to think about when I help people with intents, and this was a problem that I first saw with Dialogflow, was that people always associated an intent with an action. If that this abstract notion of the things that we say should directly tie to what we do with it. And I like to point out that's not what an intent is. All an intent represents is what we have said. Yeah. And in the same way, the fallback intent represents the fact that we didn't understand what you said. How you handle a fallback intent may be different in every case.
Yeah.
So, if I've just started you out, if I just welcomed you and I don't understand what you say, I will handle that one way. Whereas if we're deep in the skill or action and I'm giving you, the results of your shopping list and I don't understand what you say, I may prompt you differently.
Yep.
And that's important to understand. And, I think that's an important concept that most people really need to wrap their heads around, is that, yes is an intent. What are you saying yes to?
Yes has no meaning outside of a context. Yeah, because you could ask what question, it could be like, would you like to delete all of your orders? Yes. Versus, would you like to continue or would you like to learn more? Yes.
Yes.
So there's.
So it's always important to remember that any intent that we process has to be processed in a context.
Yeah, which is different than even, and this is this is a different slot type, but like my favorite music group is Yes. And
now we're getting into problems with Alexa's representation, language model.
That is definitely true. Something else, so we've talked about unhandled and we've talked about fallback, but there might be a case where your skill or action doesn't do something, but you still want to define an intent for that. For example, you might want to gather, or maybe a future version is going to do something, but you don't, it's not available yet. And you want to start gathering some statistics as far as how many times that intent gets hit to see, out of these 5 intents that we've got defined, but we don't have coded. And by don't have coded, it means code them as if it was a fallback intent.
Yep.
You can still gather statistics on the number of times that people have said the intent. And if they have slot types, you can start gathering information about the types of things that people have asked. So then maybe, it's like, how do you do such and such? And maybe this, the such and such is a slot. And you start gathering like, people are asking about such and such, whatever that thing is. And then, so then you start like, lots of people are asking about this thing. Maybe that's the next feature that we need to incorporate. And then you actually implement that intent to, give a response or, start doing whatever it is. But it's kind of like, kind of hidden, secret intents that are there, that when people say it, from their perspective, it's handled the same way as a fallback intent, but really it's there to start gathering information.
And that's important. That's especially important on the Alexa side, because you never see when fallback intents get triggered, do you?
Well, there's kind of a way that you can. So you can get, so you do get handled the fallback intent, and you could add analytics to the fallback intent to, get additional information. But you don't really know. You just know that the fallback intent happened.
You don't know.
You don't know what they said.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but there are some like anonymous statistics, like if there's at least 10 people in a month that hit a fallback intent with a certain type of certain phrase, then you start getting hints in the developer console of, these are some things that triggered the fallback intent. So then you can start updating the language model to handle those situations. But yeah, you don't know what people said unless this analytics kicks in and you get to start seeing some of those phrases. And then, they've got improvements now where you can make language model changes and get those things deployed really quickly, as opposed to going through a full certification cycle. Yeah. So that's where you start iterating on the intent model.
So that's really interesting. And as we've discussed before, on the Google side, you do get the entire phrase every time. So you know exactly what the user has said. One of the interesting issues, though, is there are cases where you don't. And these are cases where the user has said something. It would trigger either the fallback intent on Dialogflow or a no match in Action Builder. And the phrase is something that Google knows how to handle. So, and you and I ran into this a while ago, your favorite phrase, your favorite test phrase, pizza. If you said that and it would have hit the no match, Google goes, well, I can tell you about pizza joints. And it tells you your closest pizza parlor.
So it jumps out of the 3P experience into the 1P experience.
Exactly.
It tries to be really helpful.
And there are a lot of, it makes sense in some cases. What we had been seeing, we've been seeing a lot of no match or fallback intents with questions like, what's the weather? Or what time is it? And these are questions that the first party experience can answer, but obviously we can't.
Yeah.
Unless you're a weather action. But so it didn't make sense for us to even try. And the only thing we could say is, you want to quit and ask that question again. So in that way, it does make sense, but it does mean that there are sometimes things that people can say, maybe accidentally or maybe not well understood, that you wanted to hear. And there's a workaround to deal with that, so that instead of dealing with no match for a lot of my actions now, I build an intent that matches everything. And this match everything is the last possible, again, it's the intent of last resort.
Yeah.
And I treat it like it's a fallback or a no match intent, just I can't use that mechanism because otherwise Google will listen for it.
Oh, that's interesting. That's also, I've had this situation, like I was developing an Alexa skill that was doing the audio player, and audio player is weird because when you're doing Alexa skill that does audio player, you're in the skill. And then when you start the audio player, you're not in the skill anymore. It actually closes down and you're in the like 1P audio player, but it's playing content that you provided.
And you get event callbacks every so often, but it doesn't have all the information.
To add the next item in the playlist, yeah, or whatever. And then you can say stop, and then that actually loads the skill back up, a brand new instance session of the skill. So then there's different times that people got confused and they were saying like, open the name of the skill again. And so we ended up having an intent that was open, the name of the skill, so that if somebody was in the skill and tried to open it, then we could just like, just go back on into a flow that made sense. I've also seen people that have handled things like what's the weather, or some well-known things that you would say to the 1P experience. And then, sometimes they say, oh, we can't, sorry, we can't handle the weather. Or sometimes, depending on what the skill was, this one was kind of like a funny, snarky skill. Then it would say like, what are you asking me about the weather? I don't know,
right. Yeah.
Something that was in the character of the skill or something. I think they, made sure they understood that it was like, well, you're asking, XYZ skill for, yeah, such and such. That's not something I really handled, but that's a good question. Maybe you should, or something. So they didn't like break out of the skill experience, but kind of like kept them in it in a way that kind of put them back right into a place where they could keep going if they wanted to. Obviously they could exit the skill. It's not like we're stopping them from exiting the skill, but it would stop them from accidentally leaving the skill in cases where they were saying something that kind of hijacked the experience.
The experience, yeah. So yeah, I think, and it's funny, you'd think something simple like, how do you handle when you fall off the path should, yeah, be simple. And yet we've been talking now about it. There are a bunch of different approaches and solutions. And as always, it's, depends on what your conversation designer wants, but here are the things that we have in our tool chest to handle it.
Yeah, there's definitely been some fun, kind of some unexpected things. These are some kind of tips and tricks that we've uncovered over the years that we've been doing it. I'm sure we don't know them all. So if you've got some other little interesting tip or trick to handle what would be a fallback or a kind of a communication situation where it's not the happy path, we would love to hear what you have to say.
So as always, you can find us on Twitter, find us on LinkedIn, find us at Voice Lunch. We'd love your feedback, and we'd love to share it another time on Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Take care, Alan.